Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Watershed. My name is Mark Cosgrove. I'm the cinema curator here at Watershed, and delighted to welcome you to this strand conversations about cinema, impact of conflict that we're running here at Watershed. It relates to a number of films that that we have been showing and that we will be showing in the future, and just opening up a opportunity for dialogue, conversation about the themes that are explored in the film. And tonight's film is Selma, and have already been a lot of discussions in the cinema about the film and online, and we're capturing all of this at the website, which you can see just there, conversationsaboutcinema.co.uk. Um, and you can also feed in any comments or thoughts through that site. But part of it is about, as I say, opening up a conversation here, and delighted to welcome Madge, who's Professor in History at University of the West of England, who's going to give a short, probably about 10-minute introduction to Selma. And then at the end of the film, if people want to stay, we'll have a kind of short Q&A and then pick it up informally in the cafe bar. So I'm delighted to hand over to Madge. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming, and it's nice to see familiar and new faces here. And I'm particularly pleased that we're having the Q&A afterwards, because I think when you see an emotionally powerful film, it's kind of good to detox and with other people and to explore some of the themes raised. Well, I take it you all know that Selma is about the events of 1965 that are identified with Martin Luther King and the drive for voters' rights. Now, last week I had coffee with a much younger friend who'd recently seen Selma, and she said she'd found it inspiring, as she hadn't really known much about the civil rights movement before, and she certainly hadn't been aware of the particular campaign in Selma, Alabama, which the film portrays. And that pulled me up a bit short because the civil rights movement had such a formative and personal impact on my own life. I was a university student in California at the time. And it was painful to remember that it's akin to ancient history to some. And mindful of my task tonight, I asked her what would have been helpful to her to have known before she'd seen the film. 1965 was a long time ago, she said, and some historical contextualization of the civil rights movement and the various individuals portrayed in the film would have been helpful, and because it's quite a dense film in some ways. Now, of course, that was music to my ears, someone wanting historical contextualization. So it inspired me to rethink my intro tonight. And what I'd like to do for those of you born after 1965, and for those of you who have lived through the civil rights movement but can't remember it, I would like to, in the next 10 minutes, give a broad brush and shamelessly selective account of what I reckon you need to know to make sense of the film in terms of its history. In particular, I want to talk about the background to the political situation in America before 1965, identify some of the lesser-known players and factions who feature in the film, and clarify the chronology of some of the main events portrayed in it, because I too had to revisit because it's quite a complicated sort of series of events. And after that, if we have time, or perhaps we can do it in the Q&A, I'd like to offer some reflections on the relationship between film, historical accuracy, and truth, whatever that is. What is so great about this film is that it offers an alternative to a top-down and sanitized version of the movement, the kind of one that's been characterized as Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and the white folks came south to save the day. This is from a different point of view, and I think Ava DuVernay's done a really interesting and innovative job on this. Well, let's just look at the historical run-up to and I'm going to assume complete ignorance. Don't feel patronized, but sometimes it's just good to be reminded of what most of you already know anyways. But, there was a civil war in America in 1865, and it was followed by the northern dominance of the South, called the Reconstruction. And what a lot of people don't realize, that it wasn't like you had the Civil War and then you had a slow progress to civil rights unimpeded. There was quite a lot of radical reform in the immediate period after the Civil War. The South was devastated, and economically, carpetbaggers came down from the North, and there was a lot of Southern white resentment at the way that they were corrupt or took advantage. But there was also a huge increase in black civil rights, and there was the Freedmen's Bureau set up for former enslaved Africans. It was there were black congressmen, and I believe black senators in the Congress in this immediate post-war period, and there were constitutional reforms, notably the 14th and 15th Amendment, which were passed in this immediate period, which guaranteed equal protection under the law for all citizens, and the 15th Amendment, which was that citizens are citizens regardless of their color or race. So this was quite an important and radical thing. But one has to remember what features in the film is a theme, and which I don't think often British audiences pick up on, is that in America, the Civil War, particularly if you talk to white Southerners, wasn't about slavery alone. It was about states' rights. It was about this idea of the state and local government to determine its own fate without the tyranny of federal centralized bureaucratic government. So it was seen as a bid for freedom. So there is this subtext about how do you balance the federal government coming in and enforcing the Constitution and states' rights, the freedom of each state and region to determine their own destiny. Now, what happens, black people had been promised 40 acres and a mule in a way of land distribution. It never quite happened, as Oscar Brown Jr. could tell you in his song of that title. And the black congressmen and senators, their terms came to an end, and the Northerners kind of lost interest in the South, which, by the way, up until the mid-20th century was very agricultural. There was a lot of poverty there, and the industrialization was mainly in the North. So what happens is that the Republicans, who in those days were allied with the pro-abolitionist cause, they kind of lost interest in the South, and the Southern Democrats the old elites regained power. And so by the 1880s, you have a backlash against all the reforms of the post-Civil War period, and it's known as a period of Jim Crow. Have you heard of that term? Yes. And so it's the way that the constitutional amendments get ignored at state level, that there's a reintroduction of segregation, there's a reintroduction of restricting voting rights through all sorts of ways that the state government is just ignoring and flouting federal law and the Constitution. But they do it because they can. And one of the ways that the white elite kept power in the South, and this is a theme that's mentioned in the film, is that a lot of people who were white were impoverished. So the fear was that the whites and the blacks would compare class notes and realize they were mutually oppressed and get together. So the ideology of racial superiority was really flogged to the white poor. You may have a miserable existence, but my God, you're better than the black people there. And they didn't use that word, of course. This allied with other currents in American history, the rise of social Darwinism, the idea that they were sort of misusing Darwin's theory of evolution, natural selection, to sort of say that life is a struggle between the races and that the white race is superior. And this is at a time in the late 19th century that you're getting a lot of immigration now from Italy, well, Ireland first, then Italy, Eastern Europe, and there's worries about racial, the mixing of the races, competition with Germany, and the idea that the white race is endangered by these other people. So it's a kind of a mix there in the late 19th century. And of course, by the end of the 20th century, you get the separate but equal ruling by the Supreme Court that you could have segregation after all, as long as you had separate but equal facilities. And you had a series of lynchings of black people in the South that were just legalized murders, mob murders that were not prosecuted by the state at state level. And you had anti-lynching campaigners trying to get Americans interested. An African-American woman, Ida B. Wells, actually came to Bristol and did a tour of England in the 1890s to raise awareness of this sort of thing. And but it was you had many liberal supporters about it, but it was countervailed by films like, later at the beginning of the century, Birth of a Nation, which is seen as the sort of pioneering film, fantastic film about the Civil War, but which really was an apology for the Ku Klux Klan, which was in its heyday. And the other theme that you have to remember is really embedded in the American consciousness is that it's not just about race, it's about race and sex. And it's about the fear of the black man taking the white woman. This is a subtext which really gives the animus behind a lot of the Neanderthal values you'll see portrayed by some of the white supremacists in the film. There's also, by the late, sorry, I have to put my glasses on, which is a bit. You also have to remember that it's the 20s and 30s that sees, because there's so few jobs, slavery really is occurring under another name, exploitation, sharecroppers. Black people's economic lives aren't great, and they're not much better than under slavery, and in effect, they don't really have any rights. When I was in Grand Central Station last year, I bumped into, well, I was going to say an elderly black man. He was my age, well, he's just a few years older, but he remembers in the 1940s being told when his dad was trying to take him to school on a horse and wagon that the master of the plantation, he still called them the masters, said, "You get your kids picking cotton or I'll throw you all in jail. I know the sheriff." And so he never got to go to school after 10 years of age. That man marched in Selma and he was set upon by dogs, but that's another story. Anyways, you did get some black resistance by the 1930s in Selma and in Alabama, the part of the Deep South. You had something called the Dallas County Voters Leagues. Nothing to do with Dallas, Texas. Dallas is a county. And that features in the film. Now, things began to change World War II. We know that there were black GIs in Bristol, and they were amazed by how well they were treated by white working-class women. There wasn't that color and sex bar in that way. People came home with raised expectations. There was industrial expansion. You had a black urban class in the North that wasn't as deferential and grounded in church life as in the South. And in the 1950s, in the Korean War, you had the integration of troops. And by 1950s, the other theme that you should be aware of is the McCarthyism. Most of you will know what McCarthy is, the anti-communist scare, and that really informed a lot of right-wing attitudes at federal level, particularly that of the FBI. The communists were identified with some Jewish Americans, and J. Edgar Hoover had an animus against both them and black people, and you'll see him portrayed in the film. He's the head of the FBI at the time. You begin to get the beginning of the civil rights movement in 1958 with a Supreme Court ruling about desegregation of schools. In 1963, Kennedy was a real breath of fresh air, was proposing a civil rights legislation, but he was assassinated before it could come to fruition. And so Lyndon Baines Johnson, the old boy, Texan old boy, who no one would have thought was a particularly liberal guy, actually fought he was a real wheeler-dealer kind of politician. He took on the civil rights movement. He actually was a liberal on race. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had a huge amount of resistance. There was a 57-hour filibuster in the Senate, people talking for 57 hours to try to get the thing out. And it outlaws discrimination in public places. It made employment discrimination illegal and ended the unequal application of voter registration. But the Civil Rights Act, there were two problems with it. One was it wasn't enacted. The Justice Department, the federal bodies, the FBI, were just let the states enact and actually block this legislation and its enactment. They did not pursue it. And that's when you'll see Martin Luther King's beef. The other thing is Lyndon Baines Johnson had other priorities. He wanted a war on poverty. He wanted, he said that equality in America really had to be attacked at an economic and not just a political level. And you'll see a real interesting argument in the film about should they go for voter registration legislation, which is what Martin Luther King wants, or should that wait until Johnson, who is anxious to make his mark with the war on poverty, can get that on the books, and he doesn't want to jeopardize, and he has to balance between states' rights people and not alienate them so he can get some of his other legislation through, and also he's embroiled in Vietnam, so he's got other priorities. Okay, some of the major players and factions that you'll see in the film. About 5 minutes. 2, okay. You'll notice that there are quite a few women. One of the great things about this film, it isn't just the Martin Luther King show. It shows you that from the 1930s, Mrs. Amelia Boynton Johnson and her husband, Samuel Boynton, were campaigning with the Dallas registration group, and it was she who invited King in to try to get a more impetus going. And another group, the SNCC, it's called, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, you'll see them. They had come the year or two before King was down there to try to do voter registration and community work. They were met by complete reaction, obfuscation, and frustration by the white officials who acted with complete impunity. The federal government wasn't doing a thing. SNCC invited Dick Gregory and James Baldwin down to Alabama, and I think it's quite interesting that one of the counties that was even more segregated than the one immediate to Selma, Lowndes County, was where Ada DuVernay's father grew up. So I think she has a personal stake and a personal insight into this history. Anyways, I don't have time to sort of go on to the chronology of the events, but you'll notice you'll notice the split between, there were splits within the Black civil rights movement between those who wanted to integrate into white society, become equal American citizens, and those who took a Black nationalist point of view, and like Malcolm X, who was featured in the film, and felt the only way is through sticking with people of their own race. And although Malcolm X did change his views towards the end of his life, and you'll see quite an interesting treatment of that. And also between militancy, how many killings that go unpunished you have to take before you turn to violence. And I think that's one of the themes that you'll see in the film. I think I don't want to sort of bombard you with too many things, but there are 3 marches around in the film. The first one, Bloody Sunday in March. Then there's a sort of abortive march that you'll see on the 9th of March that Martin Luther King actually attended. And then the Selma to Montgomery march at the end of that month. And then after that, in August, the Voting Rights Act does get passed that guarantees the enforcement of equal voting rights for all. So maybe we can reflect in the question and answer that the film has been, lavishly praised, so it didn't get many Academy Award nominations, but it has been criticized for certain historical inaccuracies, particularly with the role of Johnson. We can talk about that and a couple silences in the film that I noticed. But do you have to be factually accurate to get to a higher or intuitive truth? That's one of the things you might want to, how do creative arts deal with history? And so maybe that's one of the things you might want to think about. I hope that's clear. Thank you.